Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to talk about Hollywood's obsession with ingenue essence. If you're not familiar with what the ingenue essence is, I'm specifically talking about the ingenue essence from the Kitchener essence chart. The Kitchener essence chart goes from dramatic, which represents more masculine types of traits and characteristics with more angle, more sharpness in the features, not only in the face but also in the body. And on the further end of the spectrum, we have ethereal or angelic. Sometimes people use one word over the other, but that is part of the more feminine part of the spectrum, which talks about more rounder features and so on. So this is what I'm speaking about. It is really similar to the kiwi type. So a lot of people use them interchangeably, but the kiwi type doesn't have ingenue or angelic as part of the different types of archetypes. Now, as far as the ingenues are concerned, ingenue comes from ingenue, which is a French word to describe a woman who is very naive and very trustful of the world, even though she shouldn't. And in Hollywood, in cinema, in theater, and in novels, there's another layer that's added to it, and it's how unsophisticated the ingenue is. So not unsophisticated because of her background or because she's poor or anything. It's unsophisticated because she is unprepared to deal with certain situations or certain people because she doesn't really have a lot of life experience. The ingenue is supposed to be sweet, really innocent and nice to others. She's supposed to be of virginal age in terms of her appearance, so there needs to be an aspect of her that's not only youthful but also innocent. And in order to create that, a lot of Hollywood agents tend to hire people who tend to have natural features. So the hair needs to be natural, the eye color needs to be natural, a lot of aspects to it needs to be natural because the ingenue has to be as much of a blank slate as possible, and it needs to be very perceivable by the audience. Now, the ingenue was really used to create the damsel in distress archetype, but also the girl next door archetype. And what's really important to understand is that a lot of people who play ingenue roles are not necessarily ingenues themselves, and so Hollywood have people working really hard to make people look as ingenuous as possible, even though it's really hard to do. Now, in terms of the physical appearance of the ingenue, on the face, the ingenue will tend to have rounder features, so rounder eyes, rounder cheeks, fuller lips. And in terms of the body, the ingenue will tend to be fleshier, so she tends to be more around the elbows, in the legs, etc. So that's also one of the biggest difference between what an ingenue is and what a gamine is. If you look at the Netflix show, Sabrina, actually you only need to look at it for a few minutes, you're going to clearly see that there is a difference between gamine and ingenue by comparing Sabrina and her best friend. Sabrina obviously displays characteristics of being really small bone and compact, just like the ingenue. But her face doesn't really have round features. She tends to have smaller lips, smaller eyes, and her face is more angular. Same for the body. The body is really straight and boyish, whereas for the ingenue, which is played by her best friend, you will see that she tends to have rounder features in the face, fuller lips, and rounder in the elbows, etc. So that's a very great show to have a very quick comparison between what an ingenue and a gamine is. Another important thing about the ingenue is that a lot of people who were born ingenue and who were ingenue between the age of maybe 18 to 24 are no longer ingenue past that age, and so it is a very hard essence to maintain throughout the lifetime of an actress. And what makes it even harder is that most surgical procedures, when it comes to plastic surgery, tend to make people look more dramatic and not really ingenue. So what happens to the ingenue after a certain age is that she will either fall into the category of being more gamine or romantic based on how she grows and how her body flesh changes throughout the years. And a very great example of that is Emilia Clarke. Emilia Clarke, who played Daenerys in the very famous show Game of Thrones, was very ingenue because the team really worked hard to make her look that way. Now when you look at her in real life with her real style, and especially since she aged, since the show was filmed, you can clearly see that there is a huge difference between before and after. And so a lot of people struggle with keeping that essence alive within them. It's really easy to look young, but looking young and innocent is really hard, especially when you're working with experts who know exactly what it looks like and who rather hire directly younger people. So the first way in which Hollywood is obsessed with ingenue is to create certain types of love interest. So there are different types of love interest. Sometimes it's rags to riches love stories. Sometimes it's love triangle. Sometimes it's second chances at love. But for this one specifically, the one that I've seen, being used a lot with ingenues are forbidden love stories, and sometimes it's usually one-sided. So the examples I'm going to use are two really good movies, American Beauty and Chloe. So I'm going to talk about American Beauty first because it is a much older movie. So for those of you who haven't watched American Movie, it is about this man who is going through a midlife crisis. He is not really respected by either his wife or his daughter. He's a bit ignored by all of them, not really respected at his job either. And one day he falls in love with the ingenue, which is the daughter's best friend. The ingenue is really aware of what's going on. Basically, she even plays into it. But what's really important is that he lacks self-confidence. He is not really in love with his life right now. And so the ingenue in this movie is kind of used as a way for him to get back in touch with his youth and his love for life in general. And actually what's really interesting to see is that we don't really see the ingenue that often. We see her at the beginning and sometimes at the end too, but I feel like most of the movie has to do with him falling in love with life again, not really the ingenue. The ingenue in the movie is really self-centered and really in search of validation most of the time. Most of the scenes are going to happen between the protagonist, which is the father, and the ingenue are not even real. Sometimes you're not even sure if it's a dream or not. So you definitely see that in terms of his life, he doesn't really need to be with the ingenue, but he needs to see her. Just the visual aspect of looking at someone who's innocent, playful, and unaware of the horrible things that can happen in life. Just that in itself is enough for him to want to start a new life and want to do things on his terms. Our second forbidden love movie is Chloe, played with one of my favorite actress, Amanda Seyfried. So Chloe is a call girl, and she is having a relationship with a woman who believes that her husband is also having a relationship with Chloe. So basically what happens is that Chloe lies to the woman and tells her that she is having an affair with her husband, even though she isn't. Obviously, the story starts very progressively. The family is supposed to be really well respected, and so it is quite hard at the beginning for her to get into it, but then it kind of just flows once the two women are together. That's also a very rare thing. For an ingenue to be with her woman is also really new in Hollywood. Usually the ingenue is a younger woman, and the protagonist and the one who's going to fall in love with the ingenue is a male. In that case, the woman is trying to go back in time, in a time where her and her husband were in love and happy together, by being with the ingenue. And so the ingenue does not just represent beauty. She represents innocence, beauty, but also the ability of going back in time to something that no longer is. And in both cases, both of the characters, the protagonists, do not have the self-confidence to simply ask for what they desire. They need to go through the ingenue and use the ingenue as vessels in order to get where they want. And in both cases, especially in Chloe, there's not a lot of information that is being told to the audience about where she comes from or how she ended up being a call girl. So all those things are not really important, because the ingenue is supposed to be not someone that the protagonist is actually in love with, but someone who's more used as a vessel to get from point A to point B and to avoid midlife crisis, because in both cases, we're really talking about people who are struggling with their midlife crisis. Another important aspect to talk about when it comes to the ingenue is that, like I said, they are blank slates. And so in both cases, the ingenue is looking to fulfill a void. It feels like in the first movie, the ingenue is looking for validation. She does have a family, but she lacks the attention, the familial attention that she desperately wants. And in the second movie, Chloe feels like she's looking for a family to almost adopt her. So it's a very weird way to get into a family. First she tries to get with the wife, and then later on the son. So it's a very weird type of energy going on. But basically the ingenue is a blank slate. She's a void in her own, and so somebody has to basically guide her into what she has to do, what she needs to be done, and then dispose of her once they are done with her. So what does that mean for real life ingenue? So if you are an ingenue and you display certain types of characteristics that make people feel like you have to obey by the rule, and basically people look at you as blank slates, well, it is really important for ingenues or people who are aware that they display certain types of ingenue characteristics to not only make their personality and their life really obvious to people, but to add that into anything that has to do with your personal branding, because people will look at you and tend to think that you are a doll ready to be used, ready to be played with. So making things very obvious about your goals, your aspirations, your wants, and your needs is a very important thing to do for most ingenues, because compared to dramatic, people are going to look at you and think they're ready to be used as if you were a toy. And so that's something that most people do not want to deal with. So if you are aware of that, just know that Hollywood also plays into it. So it's a very old thing that has been going on for a while, and novels have been doing it, theater has been doing it. So just be aware of this in order to create a better essence about yourself while still being ingenue if this is really what you want to be, because you have to be what you are. Ingenue is also really loved by Hollywood for female characters because they have the ability of creating a very high investment from the audience into the wants and desire of the main character, who is technically supposed to be the ingenue themselves. So when it comes to creating really loved female characters, it is going to be much easier for the public to be interested in them and to be compassionate and empathetic towards the main character if they display characteristics of ingenue rather than dramatic. And I'm going to explain briefly why. So first, the ingenue is going to have childlike characteristics about themselves. And so just for any kids, parents want to give them what they want, younger adults want to give them what they want. So in terms of, giving in and wanting them to be happy, you're going to have to really have this aspect about yourself that is really childlike in order to make people like you, but it needs to fit into your physical appearance. It's not going to be easy for a dramatic to do the same. So a very good example of this is in the show Game of Thrones. Emilia Clarke, who plays Daenerys Targaryen, has the ability of having everybody love her from the beginning, not only in the show but also in real life. Obviously she comes from a very wealthy background in the show. She is supposed to be the heir to the throne after her brother dies. But what's also interesting, what I've noticed, when I showed this show to so many people, they instantly had a lot of investment into the wants and the desires of Daenerys Targaryen without knowing too much about her, without watching the show for too long. They immediately wanted her to have what she wants, and so that's easily done with an ingenue. Another aspect of this is that an ingenue is going to have the ability of displaying really negative emotions such as jealousy or anger, without losing the love of the public. That's a very interesting thing to see. Ingenue will have the ability of displaying such bad behaviors, but because of what they look like and because of their essence, which tends to lean towards gentleness and naivety and innocence, it is really hard for the ingenue to lose the love of the public. Now that thing cannot be done with male characters. The male characters' strength and dominance are going to be preferable over innocence and fragility in order to have the public love you, because it just has to do a lot with gender roles. And if you want a dramatic to have that same sense of sympathy from the public, you're going to have to show her go through hell in order for the public to even show a little bit of love to the dramatic. So that's a little bit of thing. That's that's a bit unfair when it comes to your physical appearance, but it's something that is really important to know. Another thing is the dramatic is not going to be as easily forgiven by the public if she displays certain types of characteristics, or if she has done something that is seen as a negative thing. So overall, the ingenue is much more easier, especially when you're working with women characters, to make them loved by the public and to create a high intensity of investment. So what does that mean in real life? It doesn't mean that as an ingenue, everybody's going to automatically love you and want you to get what they want, but it is going to be much easier for you to do so. So if I were an ingenue, I would be I would not be scared of, wording what my wants are and what I desire, because at the same time, people kind of see you as a blank slate that needs to be told what to do, But if you make it clear that you have certain types of needs and wants and obligations, people are going to be much more lenient to give it to you than they would maybe a dramatic who look like they have it, they get it, they don't need anybody. So keep that in mind when you know for sure that you are an ingenue. Obviously, that essence is really hard to maintain. So as an ingenue, you might become a romantic or a gamine over time. But if you do have it right now, and if you know for a fact that you're going to have it for a while because maybe your mother or your aunt had it for a while, definitely use that to your advantage, because each type and each essence is going to have benefits. So might as well use what works in your favor. That is it for the video. If you guys enjoyed it, or if you have any types of insights explaining Hollywood's obsession with ingenues, please let me know in the comment section, like the video, and subscribe to my channel if you're interested in videos like this one. And I'll see you in the next one.